very good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome back to our interview this week. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Tony Nazaparat, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. And this week, we have an important and timely topic, which we will discuss on juntas who urge the foreign powers to back itself, particularly Myanmar, to return to a democracy, and also the dissolve of the National League of Democracy of Aung San Suu Kyi. And today we have Professor Dr. Desmond MOLLOY will be our special speaker for this topic. Professor MOLLOY is a political conflict analyst and also a lecturer at the Panyasas University of Cambodia. So greeting, doctor, and a warm welcome back to our interview program.
Thank you very much. Good to see you again.
So without further delay, I would like to jump into our discussion. So addressing an annual Armed Forces Day parade last week, General Min Aung Hlaing urged the international community to collaborate with all the efforts of the current government, which is under military power, in prudence to be on the right path to return Myanmar back to democracy. Myanmar's military ruler wishes to have foreign powers get behind itself in returning to democracy instead of siding with the shadow National Unity Government, NUG. Professor, in this regard, what do you think about junta's desire to return the country to democracy by urging the international community to be on its side?
Well, that would be a cold day in hell indeed, when the junta wishes to return the country to democracy. After 60 years under the jackboot, the junta allowed the beginnings of disciplined democracy in 2011, really under international pressure and in believing that it might be in its interests. But this coup happened on the 1st of February 2021 because the current commander-in-chief and the Tatmadaw had lost patience with this movement towards democracy, and it hadn't offered the benefits to the Tatmadaw that it had expected. And in fact, the commander-in-chief and the junta felt that its power was being threatened by a democratic government led by the NLD, noting that the NLD took more than 80% of the seats in the November 2020 general election and was due to open parliament within hours of the start of the coup. So, Armed Forces Day is a show of power. And the junta has been using this power brutally in the past 2 years. And even in the past month, there has been an uptick in the amount of aerial bombing, helicopter gunship attacks on civilian villages, particularly in Chin State, in Kaya State. And, for the junta to say that its neighbors and other countries should get behind it in its movement towards democracy is hard to swallow. There's no evidence of interest in democracy. The junta has repudiated ASEAN's efforts, as we noted with Excellency Hun Sen and with the Vice Prime Minister and the Special Envoy in 2022, Excellency Prak Sakhonn. Their efforts were rejected and were bookended by the gratuitous execution of four political prisoners in November 2022. So it's hard for anyone to believe that Min Aung Hlaing is interested in democracy. And, the call for support from the international community now is an effort to legitimize an illegitimate regime. So I'm not very optimistic in relation to this call. You can throw the word democracy around with ease, but actually working towards implementing democracy, as we learned from 2013 to February 2021, delivering democracy is a much more difficult situation. So, the current call from Min Aung Hlaing to support his efforts for elections are quite moot from my perspective. I'm not optimistic.
Okay, so thank you, Professor. So, shortly after the announcement, the military junta dissolved Aung San Suu Kyi National League for Democracy Party (NLD) for failing to re-register under the tough new military drafted electoral law. But from your point of view, Professor, do you think this is the right act for the junta to do so, as the electoral law is just in the process of drafting and has not yet been approved?
Well, it's hard to say that the process of drafting electoral law hasn't been approved while the law, as announced, is being implemented, with 40 political parties, including the NLD, that took more than 80% of the seats in November 2020, has been dissolved, not because it failed to meet the requirements, but because it refused to recognize the legitimacy of the junta and did not take part in the registration process. Now, if the junta is not legitimate, then the Union Electoral Commission is not legitimate. Therefore, the entire process of registration, and one that excludes the representative of the vast majority of Myanmar citizens from representation in an election, cannot be legitimate. And such an election would be a sham. So I don't believe that the junta is concerned with what's right or what's wrong. It has its objectives. It has zero-sum objectives, and nothing has changed in the 2 years since the coup. And this call for an election that was due, they said would be held within 2 years of the coup, and then they extended the state of emergency for a further 6 months up to August. So while they have not announced any date for an election, it could not happen during a state of emergency, so not before August. But even with that, the Union Electoral Commission hardly has the capacity to implement an election, especially an election that is operating a new system of counting through proportional representation that they haven't used in the past. So again, I don't feel that the right action has been taken in declaring these laws, which are clearly about the exclusion of opposition that represents the majority of the people of Myanmar. And an election that moves ahead under such circumstance can hardly be called legitimate.
Thank you, Professor. How will the dissolution of the NLD affect the future of democracy in Myanmar, and will the people of Myanmar accept this? And what is their reaction to the action that the junta dissolve the party NLD of Aung San Suu Kyi?
Well, I think the expulsion of 40 parties that represent, I presume, something in the region of 90% of the people of Myanmar can hardly be called legitimate. And you ask, how will this impact on the future of democracy in Myanmar? Well, it's hard to imagine that the future of democracy in Myanmar will be under the control or under the jurisdiction of this current military junta. So we'll have to see how the situation pans out, how negotiations, a period for negotiation at some time in the future, certainly not in the short term, might lead to openings for democracy. But in this current circumstance, there is little scope for the broadening of democracy. And the exclusion of the opposition parties that represent about 90% of the wishes of the people of Myanmar certainly contributes nothing to the legitimacy of the junta or to democracy in Myanmar.
Okay. So back to the urge of General Min Aung Hlaing, or for the foreign power to back itself to return the country back to democracy. Do you think this plan is workable for democracy restoration in Myanmar, and is it beneficial for the people of the country?
Well, the international community has already hung its hat on the ASEAN 5-point consensus, which was agreed by Min Aung Hlaing in April 2021 in Jakarta meeting. And that 5-point consensus, certainly the UN Security Council happily passes the book to ASEAN. Currently under Indonesia, we have seen a lackluster start to Indonesia's first 3 months, but we're told by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, Retno Marsudi, that action is being taken and that they have started to speak to special envoys in an initial effort to open communications with stakeholders. But it is quite disappointing that there is zero progress in the area of the 5-point consensus. Certainly, Japan is making some effort in Rakhine State with the Nippon Foundation's humanitarian distribution under the Arakan Army, through civilian NGOs, trying to set a precedent and build on what worked reasonably well during the transitional government and during the period of the NLD government from 2015 to 2021, of using humanitarian aid as an entry point to build confidence in a nationwide ceasefire agreement. The Nippon Foundation is continuing to make that effort. That is the only area where humanitarian assistance is functioning to some degree. But we've seen no progress, and there is no plan B other than the 5-point consensus at the moment. And we have to see how Indonesia can take this process forward. But so far, we're told that it's like a swan, calm above water and working like crazy, paddling like crazy under the water. But there's little evidence of that other than these meetings with special envoys, which is no great task, really, to talk to special envoys that are amenable to talking to everybody. So hopefully Indonesia will take a stronger case in moving forward, but we're still looking at the zero-sum objectives of the junta, and it has not paid respect to ASEAN, and maybe ASEAN needs to think of taking stronger action, and there is potential for stronger action within the Charter of ASEAN, within section number 20 of the Charter of ASEAN, which would allow for suspension of Myanmar if it has violated the Charter, and that would have to be decided. But at the moment, calling for international support for their efforts for what would be an illegitimate election that excludes the representation of 90% of the people, and that it's hard to see how the result would be anything but whatever the junta says it is hardly inspiring. So I think the international community should take this call backing the junta in its efforts to run some sort of an election, some sort of the cover, a facade of an election. It would be a mistake for the international community to back such an effort.
So, yes, thank you, Professor. In response, how does the international community react such the action that junta desire to return the country back to democracy, as well as the dissolve of the entity? And last but not least, what is your recommendation that ASEAN should respond to this action, and particularly different powers?
Well, okay, as I said, the junta has used the word democracy. I think really the majority of members of the international community are not under any illusion that junta is interested in democracy. It's interested in consolidating its power, in retaining full control over the economic assets of Myanmar, and in oppressing, suppressing any form of dissent, as it has been doing most brutally, violently. It is meeting some resistance, but even the resistance is not as organized as it should be 2 years into the coup. The NUG is not demonstrating much more capacity than Aung San Suu Kyi did in the term that she ran government. She did not demonstrate any great political acumen in bringing the peace process forward or in stabilizing the environment, peace and the security environment in Myanmar. So from the point of view of democracy, to say that how the international community should take this effort of the junta to move towards democracy, well, how can you believe that the junta wants to move towards democracy? And most don't believe it. Some countries, neighboring countries, would like to see some form of legitimization of the junta that would stabilize the environment. But in reality, it's clear that the junta has little interest in democracy. Now, and what the international community can do, well, we have said that the international community has outsourced its responsibilities, particularly the UN Security Council, to the resolution of this problem to ASEAN. And currently, His Excellency Hun Sen made great efforts using his personal charm, using the Asian style of personal interaction with Min Aung Hlaing, and it didn't work. And as I said, it was bookended by the execution of the political prisoners in Yangon. So I think that the international community has to, or ASEAN, who has landed with the problem, has to strengthen its response, has to reach out. I believe that there is a need to start to consider talking to national unity government. And that is very, very controversial for several reasons. One, if the national unity government is legitimized, well, then its call for the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court would be legitimized. Now, the fact that the permanent representation of the previous NLD government is still the permanent representative of Myanmar in the United Nations gives some aspect of legitimacy to a national unity government that is made up of elected members, primarily elected members of the NLD, primarily those elected in the election of November 2020. So if the NUG were to get some form of legitimacy, it might accelerate the need for the junta to move from zero-sum objectives to actually negotiate. So until there is a change in the context and the environment in Myanmar, there is no space for negotiation at the moment. And it's, I think, the role of ASEAN to try to contribute to opening the space for negotiation, because the solutions will be internal. There will be no external solutions imposed on Myanmar. They will be handled internally, and it's up to the junta and the opposition to deal with this. Now, the opposition is very fractured, very diverse, and with diverse motivation already. And some of the ethnic armed groups are aligned tentatively with the junta, seeing their potential benefits and stability and their access to their business interests being shared with the SAC, with the State Advisory Council under the junta. And the NUG needs to demonstrate more capacity to develop a collaborative environment and to bring more support from ethnic minorities and from other opposition parties. There's an absence of coordination in the opposition. Now, when that opposition can coordinate in a stronger way and can provide a legitimate opposition to the junta, there will be a need for negotiation. That's my opinion.
So, yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Desmond, for the precise and insightful answer. And ladies and gentlemen, our interview today has now come to an end due to the time constraint. And once again, I would like to pay my sincere appreciation to Dr. Desmond MOLLOY for your valuable time and your kind contribution joining us today to provide a very profound discussion on the topic regarding to the urge of the military junta to the foreign power to back itself, return the country back to democracy and the dissolve of the National League for Democracy. So thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So please stay safe and have a good health and happy Khmer New Year.
And happy New Year to you too. Thank you very much. See you
Thank
soon.
you, Professor. Yes, thank you.